itself in other ways. One is with the status entitlement provisions of the Indian Act. The double mother clause and other forms of discrimination, were a rough tool to limit federal budget responsibilities to our First Nations. The 1985 Indian Act amendments removed some gender-based discrimination, but replaced it with another rough tool of discrimination involving blood quantum requirements. As a result, the second generation cutoff rule is now used to arbitrarily limit entitlement to Indian status. Canada replaced one problem by creating another. We all know that the control of the federal crown is most resistant to give up. It's determining who falls under the colonial label of Indian. But we also know that our people are entitled to belong to our people and to have our entitlements to rights, programs, and services determined according to our laws and policies. The first logical step is to align Indian status with band membership as determined by First Nations. The next step is to move away from dehumanizing categories such as 6.1 and 6.2. It is time for Canada to stop trying to achieve budget savings by systemically denying our people their entitlements and trampling on our right to self-determination. Over the past couple of weeks in Ottawa, we had met with the Prime Minister and opposition leaders about the urgency of getting First Nations clean water legislation back into Parliament. It was a low point watching Parliament kill the Clean Water Bill last fall. We can't let that happen again, and we won't. Water is so important to us, and it's not merely a resource commodity to be traded or consumed. It is a gift from the Creator, flowing through the veins of this land and connecting all living beings. BC Chiefs know this better than anyone else. Water sustains not only our bodies, but our spirits, our traditions, our way of life, and the economy of this country. First Nations are united in the belief that water is a fundamental human right. Speaking at our AFN election forum in April, the Prime Minister promised to introduce a bill similar to the Clean Water Act that died in Parliament last year. We have called on him again and all ministers to honor that promise in this session that he made to each and every one of you. In addition to reintroducing the Clean Water Act, we have also been talking to the Prime Minister about the national significance of finally closing Canada's First Nations infrastructure gap. Clean water systems are one element that clean water systems are one element of that, and dozens of boil water advisories unfortunately still remain in our communities across the country. Investing to close the infrastructure gap also means quality housing, modern schools, high-speed internet access, community health, emergency services, and all-season roads. During the election, the Prime Minister described the opportunity to close the First Nations infrastructure gap as nation building. More recently, he referred to it as a responsibility. The Prime Minister said that the strategic investments required to close the infrastructure gap will offset all of Trump's tariffs. He acknowledged thousands of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs that would be created. We echoed these points to the Finance Minister when we talked to him again last week about the federal budget. So I will say a few words about next week's federal budget, which is November the 4th. In August, the Assembly of First Nations presented our pre-budget submission to Canada as a blueprint for prosperity. We updated it to reflect urgent priorities identified at the Annual General Assembly regarding the state of emergency facing First Nations related to the fentanyl, opioid and addiction crisis. This is an issue that hits very close to home for all of us, and we lift each of you up for everything that you are doing to try and keep up with the crisis. It also makes me think of Justice Murray Sinclair, who famously, I remember his famous quote when he said, "Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out." And we think of this statement in the context of the root causes of the state of emergency in our communities. And we think of it in the same context of next week's federal budget, which will be presented on the first anniversary of Senator Sinclair's passing. So we've invited Canada to honor Justice Murray Sinclair, his legacy next week, with a once-in-a-generation investment in First Nations education, training, and languages. Canada's education system was used as a tool to try and erase our cultures, take our language, and break our spirit. Today, it must be a tool to empower First Nations youth and uplift our children. Alongside education and in support of First Nations children and families, we are also demanding to Canada that they protect the $47.8 billion we negotiated last year for sustainable long-term reform of this country's racist child welfare system. Those funds are for First Nations children and families, and they are not meant to be redistributed as part of any budget-cutting exercise. Talking to chiefs over the summer and at the Assembly, many are concerned about the looming prospect of budget cuts. We have been hearing reports of rollback on First Nations education funding and resources to support treaty negotiations. If realized, these misguided cuts would represent a significant setback for reconciliation and the Canadian economy. Canada has confirmed plans to protect health, education, policing, and social service payments to provincial governments from budget cuts, and they need to do the same for First Nations, and we've been pushing very hard at the Prime Minister on this. We have told the Prime Minister that this is not acceptable, that same policy being applied to provinces must also be applied to First Nations communities when it comes to health, your education, policing, and every service that you provide to your members. Because we know that the persistent gap in socioeconomic outcomes between First Nations and the rest of Canada coincided with the 2% budget cap that Canada imposed to our people for decades. New investments by the previous government started to make a difference, and so now is not the time to go back and undo that progress, and we keep stressing that to the Prime Minister. Last month, the AFN, the Chiefs in Assembly, was the first time that Chiefs were able to gather and to discuss the Building Canada Act, since it was rushed through Parliament over 20 days in June. When Bill C-5 was introduced, we warned parliamentarians about the limited time First Nations rights holders were provided to review and respond to the bill. We warned them about the experience that Chiefs had with similar pieces of fast-track legislation in British Columbia and in Ontario. And so we lift up the Chiefs for your fight on this. Sadly, Parliament did not listen. Instead, the federal government asked First Nations, asked all Canadians, asked environmentalists to just trust them on Bill C-5. At our September Assembly, Chiefs said not again. It was clear that rights holders have no confidence in the government to honor promises. And Canada can create all the project offices and advisory groups that they want, but Chiefs are united when it comes to the approval of large national infrastructure projects on First Nations land. There is no getting around First Nations rights holders. Until an appropriate process is established and founded in free, prior, and informed consent from First Nations, the Crown's legal obligations will not be met. First Nations must be full and equal partners in all nation-building efforts. But we remain concerned that Canada has failed to act on their commitment to the United Nations Declaration Act in relation to Bill C-5. The truth is that fully implementing the United Nations Declaration will create conditions for the stronger and more diversified economy we are all seeking. So it's disappointing to see the government not following through on their own laws. Today, the AFN will be releasing our progress report on Canada's implementation of the United Nations Declaration Act. The report tracks Canada's progress in implementing its commitments made under the UNDA Act, plan released in June of 2023. Unfortunately, when you look at the report, progress is not the first thing that comes to mind. While there are some examples of progress, accelerated action is clearly needed. So we lift up Chief TG, Regional Chief TG, the BC Chiefs, and the leadership that have helped us complete this report and shine a light on the government's action and inaction. Of the progress report, 9 measurement categories, only 2 show moderate progress, 3 showed some progress, while 4 demonstrated little to no progress. None of the categories have shown substantive progress. This report will be shared with parliamentarians as a reminder of their responsibility to implement the United Nations Declaration and to respect our free, prior, and informed consent. With next week's budget, they can do something about it and convert words to deeds. Sadly, 2 of the categories in the United Nations Declaration report that'll be released today with little to no progress are in the areas of civil, political, cultural, and language rights. So before I conclude, I'll say a few words about some of the justice issues we have been spending a lot of time with in Ottawa. Bail reform and hate crime legislation are being debated in Parliament. The Justice Minister confirmed that more legislation is expected in the coming weeks. It will be more important to ensure First Nations voices are heard in Parliament on these bills, because Indigenous people account for 33% of federal prisoners, but just 5% of Canada's adult population. And sadly, 50% of all women behind bars are Indigenous women. I recently visited inmates at a federal penitentiary, and let me tell you, it was just horrendous to see the conditions, those are our people in there, most of them. And it was disheartening I'm glad I spent the day with them. I went to Max, and people were so scared to go in, but I sat in the cells with these young men, and those were our sons, our nephews, our brothers. We have to do better. We have to figure out a way to make sure that everybody's getting an equal access to basic things like education, our homes, or infrastructure. And when I left there that day, I just felt so heavy, and I'm so thankful for people like Dr. Gwen Point and some other elders back home. One of them had called me that night actually, and they said, "Can you come over?" And I'm so glad I'm so glad for our ceremony and our way of life, because that helped me out of that rut that day. It was really, really heavy to attend there. But those are our young men, and I just can't we give them a better life as they grow up? And I'm glad that you're all sitting here today, because that's just what we're all trying to do. And we've come a long way, and we have a long way to go. So I think that's just what I want to say on that piece. The overrepresentation in the justice system is deeply intertwined with the First Nations infrastructure gap. When people lack access to adequate safe housing, schools, and community resources, it often leads them down a path that ends with the justice system. And so we need to change. This country is entering a new era of economic, political, and cultural change. Let's make this a new era of First Nations justice too. The good news is that solutions exist. In June, the Assembly of First Nations released our First Nations Justice Strategy. Years in the making with First Nations from across the country, the strategy builds on the foundational work of the BC First Nations Justice Council, and it supports the calls for justice from the public inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We lift up all the chiefs, the leaders, and the experts that helped co-develop this landmark strategy with Canada, including many of you. I don't know if Judith Sayers is here, but I lift you up in a good way. Corey Wilson and the Justice Council. We are proud of the work because this strategy represents a blueprint for positive change on two clear paths. First, revitalizing First Nations laws and legal systems. And second, reforming the Canadian criminal justice system. These two paths highlight 25 strategies and First Nations-driven approaches to long-standing justice issues. Decades of research and advocacy have laid the groundwork. What is needed now is, of course, political will in Ottawa and from the provinces. First Nations have also waited too long for action on policing and on community safety. Too often, discriminatory police action leads to serious injuries or death. Over-policing, under-policing on reserve, over-policing off reserve, and over-representation of First Nations people in federal corrections. Effective First Nations policing must be rooted in community values, not colonial models. Today, First Nations-led police forces are demonstrating how community-based, culturally grounded models of policing can lead to safer, healthier outcomes in all regions. They don't just enforce laws. First Nations police embody community values. They lead with peace, but force, but they are underappreciated. It has been almost 1 year since the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it's no longer acceptable for provinces and the federal government to underfund First Nations policing. The failure of federal and provincial governments to end this discrimination in our First Nations policing and justice system contradict the spirit of reconciliation. Speaking to chiefs during the election, the Prime Minister recognized that First Nations policing as an essential service, just like every other Canadian community. In addition to introducing legislation quickly, he talked about supporting self-administered First Nation policing services and tripartite agreements. Parliament must act on this province with essential service and with new First Nations policing investments this fall. We have the data, and First Nations have the people, and First Nations have the plan. Just like justice reform, all that is needed is political will of the provinces and the federal government. In July, we also had the opportunity, I had the opportunity to present these issues to the premiers. So all the premiers gathered. We gathered in Huntsville in Ontario. In the end, premiers agreed to our long-standing call to host a First Ministers meeting, but it wasn't without push and pull. Let me tell you, sitting around that table with all the premiers of this country, and I said, it's so disheartening every time there's a federal, provincial, territorial table, or a Council of the Federation, you give us an hour the day before and then you kick us out. I said, and I feel for national chiefs before me that have been treated that same way. And I said, it's like a little kiddie table. Come and have lunch and then you have to leave, go back to school, right? And so I said that, and Doug Ford got offended and he said, this is a decision-making table. And I said, well, then make a decision and allow First Nations foundational people to be, we helped found this country with you, and now all of you want to just kick us out. And we had a pretty big debate on that. And then Danielle Smith came at me, and she said, what about the AFN? What authority do you have? And I said, well, what authority do you have? You have no land to give away, and you're trying to tell the U.S. that you do. And but anyways, we got out of that, and we were united in our call for a First Ministers meeting on First Nations issues. And so we're just waiting the date now from the Prime Minister, and that's the first time since the 80s. Those conversations are not easy, and we're not going to solve everything with a one-day meeting. But I feel for people like Mandy Gall-Masty, Minister Masty. I said, you don't even have an FPT table, and this is how things happen sometimes with the provinces and the feds. Nobody's talking to each other. So we will get our meeting, and we need to decide for ourselves, chiefs, we're not going to solve anything in one day on that, but what are the most important? So I'm going to look to the direction of my colleague as well, Regional Chief TG, to as we develop that we work together and that we try and push some things that we need to push in this country. There's so many, right? And what are the top 3? And so I talked to the Prime Minister about that last week, and he had committed to that, and I think he wanted it within a month. I think that's too quick. We need time to plan accordingly and figure out what we want to push for ourselves. So I'll leave that with you and I'm open to your suggestions on that, but I'd like the Chiefs in Assembly to come up with a decision on that and tell us the way forward on that. But I'm glad we pushed them, and I'm thankful to the premiers as well, even though we had our debates. But they have to be told too. They're just the little governments. And yeah. It is 2025, so it's finally time that First Nations are at that table. Just to conclude, when federal and provincial governments tried to exclude First Nations from the process to repatriate the Constitution in the early 1980s, our leaders fought to ensure that Section 35 was included to affirm our treaty and pre-existing inherent rights. Then First Nations were told that Section 35 was simply an empty box, that any rights we thought that we have must be negotiated again through agreements. So we fought again in Canada's court system and proved that wrong over and over. No one talks about Section 35 as being an empty box anymore. There are now hundreds of court decisions affirming the substance and strength of the constitutional affirmation of our First Nation rights. We raise this history because First Nations rights must be taken seriously. The history of the Crown First Nations relationship demonstrates that we have had to overcome great odds to protect our rights, our laws, our lands, our resources, and our waters. We have fought in Parliament, we have fought in the courts, and we have fought on this land to protect our rights. Nothing has been given to us, and we are not going back. Chiefs, you work unbelievably hard. You put yourself on the line each and every day to help your communities and your families. Through it all, we will be here with you together, just as our elders and our ancestors has wanted us to work together. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak today and report on some of our issues. Just right after I leave from here, I am going to see the Council of the Catholic Bishops, and I just forgot the media is in the room, so I won't tell you, but I think Dr. Point can keep you on that, but she'll be helping me lead some important work in the months ahead, and I look for your ceremony, your love, and your commitment, Chiefs, but I'll leave that with Dr. Point to discuss. So, Jimmy Gwetch, thank you. Thank you so very much for having us, and we'll see you a little bit later this afternoon. Miigwech. Thank you.
As the National Chief has noted, she will be with us for the morning, and she is participating in the medal ceremony at 1 o'clock, and then so she is available for conversations and questions in that way. With your permission, though, I will move to our next agenda item, which is the Child and Family Services discussion and the long-term reform. We are joined by Chief Helen Henderson, the BC representative on the National Children's Chiefs Commission, Deb Foxcroft, who is the co-chair of the National Children's Chiefs Commission, Mary T.G. for Our Children Our Way, and of course, Cindy Blackstock from the First Nations Caring Society. I'll now invite the four of them here to microphones 1 and 2.
Good morning, everyone. Uklama Quills, Deb Foxcroft, Sishat Aksup. Just coming, I just wanted to acknowledge the Musqueam First Nation for having us here and hosting us for this very important meeting, and just hold up my hands and honor